Hi, everybody. um, I'm so glad that we can somehow meet under the current exhausting and terrifying circumstances that we've been enduring. And thanks a lot to Booksmart for coordination. I want to introduce the speaker, Marlene Ann Bumgarner, a former local resident and an old friend. I particularly recall our exciting meeting at the 1982 San Jose State University graduation, where we both received advanced degrees. And as a resident of Morgan Hill myself since 1970, of course, our shared memories of the pre-1980 laid back and unnoticed town of Morgan Hill, the farmer-friendly Gunter Brothers and the feed store and the Squirey Brothers, the Saturday flea market, the fruit stands along Monterey Highway, the vanishing prune orchards, one of which was right across the street from where I live, and for sure the never-ending growth control issues, including Save El Toro, Measure E, and in those pre-computer days, walking the entire Holiday Lakes for a campaign, an election campaign. Marlene has captured the very serious Back to Nature movement and its issues and implications. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce Marlene Ann Bumgarner to present her new book, Back to the Land in Silicon Valley. For sure, let's see, what is Silicon Valley? Yeah, we know what that is now. Okay. And I also want to introduce Robin Shepard. Where's Robin? She's an independent journalist and documentary filmmaker and works as a developmental editor for emerging book authors. In her previous career, she held corporate and agency management roles in brand and marketing, including Addy Award-winning programs. Robin is a creative director and producer of the Stories from the Past and the History Makers documentary series from the Morgan Hill Historical Society. And she's going to do the questions and answers after Marlene is finished with her book. So Marlene, let's go.
Okay, well, I'm really glad to see you all here today. Some old friends and new friends. This is a really interesting way of doing things, this whole Zoom business, and we've all become experts at it in the last few months.
You like the old
All right,
way.
I think that you like the old way better. I think Nancy is going to set this up so you can see the screen while I am reading, or do I need to do that, Nancy? Oh, there you go. All right. So I will read. I'm actually going to read from my book because I'm more comfortable doing that, but you're seeing an actual printed copy of the book. Can you all see it? Is it too small? You can see it?
I can see it.
All right, good. All right, so here we go. Grandma, why are your gloves way up there where you can't reach them? My 7-year-old granddaughter, Stella, piped up. I dropped down on my heels and gently asked her to move so I wouldn't hit her with the pruners. I reached up again, reaching high over my workbench, stretching as high as I could. When had a simple activity like retrieving a tool from the pegboard become so challenging? I held my breath, lifted the pruner off its hook, and caught one handle to soften its fall. It landed on the bench with a satisfying clunk. I turned toward Stella. Her upturned face still held a questioning look. The gloves? Why are they up there with your tools? Oh, those, I said, trying to stay on task. I don't use that pair anymore. But why? They're worn out. Let's go back to the garden, Lovey, before it starts to rain. Here, we both have perfectly good gardening gloves in this basket, and there are my secateurs. You can cut the frost damage off the morning glory while I trim the broken branches on the persimmon tree. I looked at the gathering clouds, inhaled the rich scent of sweet earth. We have just enough time to finish before the rain starts again. I thought I had distracted her, but I underestimated this child's persistence where mysteries are concerned. She began interrogating me again. But why keep those old gloves if you don't use them, Grandma? Why not throw them out or give them to Goodwill? Why put them way at the top of the pegboard where you can't reach them? I can reach them, I said, standing on my toes again and demonstrating. When I held them up, two of the glove's fingers hung sadly, torn most of the way through. I pulled the gloves onto my hands, the hairs on the back of my neck standing to attention from the way the suede felt rough on my palm. The stiff leather crunched slightly as I flexed my hands open and shut. A brown scar ran across one palm of one of the gloves. The acrid scent of the old leather tickled my nose. These aren't ordinary gardening gloves, Stella. They're meant for heavy work. I keep them up there to help me remember, I said softly. Remember what? Oh, honey, so many things. When I was young and lived on the land. Tell me, please, Grandma, did you use them when you were raising rabbits and goats? It was at that moment that I realized it was time. Time to tell the stories. Nearly a decade of my life, a period that changed how I perceived the world and my place in it, had drifted into the recesses of my memory as I had raised my family, pursued a career, aged. My land partners were aging too. Dory passed first, and then John. Quincy couldn't remember the details of our time together anymore, and I hadn't seen Nina in years. Bob and Jan are so busy with their young family, they don't have time to reminisce. I'm 72 years old. If I don't share my memories soon, they'll be gone. I perched on a barrel filled with wild birdseed and pulled the precious child onto my lap. Her turquoise ponytail hung down below my knees. Did I ever tell you about the first time Grandma tried to build a fence? My husband John and I moved off the grid in 1973 to create a safe space for our daughter. We wanted to escape the divisiveness and violence of the Vietnam War era, the televised scenes of battle, protests, and students bludgeoned in the streets. We were both disillusioned and demoralized by the media's portrayal of the war, the deaths of our national heroes, the years of political conflict. All the time we were making our way through college and graduate school, unrest had been roiling through the land. Gosh, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Now that we had a child, we wanted to shield her from the discord. I was 26, John was 33. Time to settle down. Over the next several years, we and a group of friends created a life in the country that nourished our souls. We grew vegetables and flowers, milked goats and birthed kids, built fences, mucked out rabbit cages, chicken coops, goat pens, built compost piles, lit our homes with oil lamps and heated water on propane stoves. In time, I gave birth to a second child, a son. During this time, we all worked together, ate together, sang together, learned together. We had a good life. After living close to the natural cycles of the earth year after year, good and not good, we grew stronger and more resilient, learned to manage our occasional conflicts with tolerance and love. One by one, our friends left the land for other adventures. As much as I loved our life in the country, I couldn't carry on without them. Eventually, I left too, to pursue my dreams of teaching and writing and to help our children learn how to live gently on the land. Once again, our nation is being pulled apart. School shootings, public Twitter fights, innocent children jailed at the border, young men and women sent into harm's way, talk of a border wall. Years of efforts to reduce our human damage to the earth reversed by the stroke of a pen, and now a global pandemic, police brutality, and riots. Sometimes it feels overwhelming, especially for those of us still living in Silicon Valley. The rapid growth of technology spawned during this era has affected our world, the state of the earth, and how our children grow up. It must be tempting for families to turn away from the noise, to hide in their homes, to keep their children close. I found it so back in the 1970s. I know that retreating to the land isn't the only solution. However, it is one way to heal our pain and come to appreciate the natural cycles of life. Standing in my garage that day with Stella, feeling the old work gloves on my hands and a rush of memories in my heart, I understood that, truly grokked it. It is time to share my story with the next generation. I want them to understand the joy and the pain of living close to the earth and the deep knowledge of themselves that it can bring. Families don't have to go back to the land to learn how to care for the earth, but if they do, they may begin to see the world differently. That evening, I began to write. I'm going to read chapter 3 to you. I chose chapter 3 because it's about Morgan Hill, and I thought that would be fun. Chapter 3, Exploring Morgan Hill. Dory and Quincy drove their 1961 school bus to the property on December 1973. Even though Quincy had removed the original engine and replaced it with an International Harvester straight six, we agreed that it would be unwise to drive the bus up the steep road to the top of our property during the rainy season. Instead, they parked at one side of the clearing where John and I planned to establish our own homestead. John and I would stay on Mount Hamilton until I finished final exams in late January. Meanwhile, we set up an Army surplus tent on the remaining side of the clearing and outfitted it with camping stove, lamps, sleeping bags, etc. During December and January, John and I drove to the property every weekend to clear poison oak and other invasive shrubs from the edges of the clearing, help Dory and Quincy build animal pens, and prepare meals together. We bought a large metal garden shed from Sears and assembled it on a concrete block foundation. We began to move our books and tools and boxes from Mount Hamilton into the shed and to gear up our search for a small travel trailer or all-weather tent to live in. Meanwhile, John and Quincy each bought a classic four-wheel drive vehicle. Quincy acquired a 1942 Jeep. It looked like all the Jeeps I had ever seen in World War II movies. He named the vehicle Nuts because it didn't have doors. And one day, a large branch got caught in the open cockpit while he was driving and, well, you get the point. My husband fell in love with a rusty 1939 Dodge flatbed truck. He found it sitting on the side of Mount Hamilton Road with a for sale sign on it. After negotiating an affordable price, he drove it to Morgan Hill, over 50 miles, at 15 miles an hour, using only back roads. It had no front windshield, but John enrolled in a welding class at the local high school and soon had fashioned an authentic-looking windscreen. He named his acquisition Sarge and bragged that it would climb a tree if he asked. Nuts and Sarge were versatile vehicles. They could negotiate the ungraded pathways and roads on our land, carry large objects or many objects, tow other vehicles, and haul water in 50-gallon fiberglass tanks that the men constructed on the bed of each truck. They were important members of our homestead. Sometimes during those early weekends, we hiked to the top of our property just because we could. Dory and Quincy dreamed about where they would park the school bus, animal sheds, and a barn. John and I enjoyed the peacefulness of the setting and the glorious view from the top of the hill. Other days we went further afield, visiting the Polish family down Chesborough Lake Drive, or walking to the edge of the reservoir and going for a swim. One day we decided to drive into the nearby town of Morgan Hill. Morgan Hill in 1974 was small. Only 6,500 people were reported in the 1970 census compared to 45,000 in 2017. It hadn't yet been impacted by the technology boom in places like Sunnyvale, Mountain View, and San Jose. No freeways or overpasses yet. Highway 101 was still a narrow two-lane road that widened only slightly through the main part of town. There, its shoulder served as a parking lot for a string of commercial properties. Running at right angles to the highway, Main Street housed the post office, 2 banks, a general store, dry cleaners, and a pharmacy in its 3 blocks. Several small eating and drinking establishments dotted the highway both north and south of Main Street. That day, we decided to explore some of the businesses along the highway. As Quincy parked his Chevy pickup on the shoulder, I wondered how the proprietors of these local stores would feel about long-haired young people walking through their front door. We were all aware that a group of hippies had been forced out of residential camps in the Santa Cruz Mountains a year earlier, and John and I had encountered some unpleasantness from locals when we drove through Georgia and Arkansas in our Volkswagen bus in 1970. The film Easy Rider had come out in 1969, pitting bikers, hippies, and farmers against one another in a creative plot that reflected the tensions of the time. But while we didn't identify ourselves as hippies, we didn't use hallucinogenic drugs for a start, and both men had paying jobs, we did meet the generally accepted definition of hippies as being of unconventional appearance, having long hair and rejecting mainstream values. Our experience in the South had sensitized me to how we might look and seem to others. I knew we wouldn't be popular with everyone. John and I exchanged thoughtful glances as we climbed out of the bed of the Adams truck and crossed the yard into Gunter Brothers feed store. Seeing a forklift heading our way, John hoisted Donia onto his shoulders. As we walked, I expected some kind of reaction from the workers in the yard, but they were busy unloading a truck piled high with sacks of feed and ignored us. Quincy and John were dressed in their usual Pendleton shirts over white t-shirts and faded blue jeans. Today they were sporting ponytails fastened with matching thick black rubber bands. John had grown his beard out over the last few months. I wore a long skirt and my usual dangly earrings, and my red hair reached nearly to my waist. Dory was dressed like a guy in a blue work shirt and loose blue jeans. She had tucked her close-cropped hair into a straw hat. We looked pretty normal for Santa Cruz or Berkeley, but so far we had seen no one else in Morgan Hill who looked like us. We had arrived at the entrance of the feed store. A dour-looking old man in overalls and a worn baseball hat stood at the front counter. I held my breath. With perfect timing, Donia turned on the charm from her perch on John's shoulders, and while Quincy explained to the old gentleman that we owned property up by Chesborough Reservoir and needed supplies, the overalled man made goo-goo eyes at Donia. He grinned broadly when Dory and I chimed in together, asking where we would find chicken, rabbit, and goat feed. He introduced himself as Merv. Mervyn Gunter, it turned out, one of the owners, and inquired about our farm and our animals. He walked around the store with us, pointing out various items he thought we might find useful, such as feeders, salt licks, hay hooks, goat harnesses, and halters. Dory handed a list to Quincy. While the men collected and paid for our supplies, Dory and I explored the further reaches of the store. I stopped to examine the wide variety of equipment and supplies available for sale, most of which I'd never seen before. There were bins of goat, rabbit, pig, chicken, dog, cat, and cattle. They all looked the same to me. Also, several varieties of pasture seed, vitamins and minerals, equine and canine dewormer paste, and pine pellet horse bedding, which Dory said her dad had used for cat litter boxes. Buckets of loose vegetable seeds, watermelon, kale, collards, spinach, lima beans, and soybeans, and that was just the front row. Dory held up a bright green cube-shaped can of bag balm. "You should get some of this," she said. I have a little baby one here. Some of you may recognize it. "You're joking," I laughed. "I'm not. It's a really useful item to have on hand. It's meant for sore cow and goat nipples and chapped udders, but my dad uses it on his hands in the winter after milking or working in the barn." Oh, I could see how that might be useful, but most items along the back wall bewildered me. What was a clevis, a baffle, a barn door single box rail splice bracket? Back up front, waiting for Dory to pay for the bag bomb, I read some of the notices on the wall. Most of the handwritten cards advertised lambs and kids and calves for sale. Someone advertised a flock of guinea fowl, whatever those were. Other cards listed various services: hoof trimming, horseshoeing, butchering. I looked around, inhaling the smell of alfalfa hay mixed with grain, molasses, veterinary, pharmaceuticals, and old wood. I had been a bit overwhelmed by it when we first came in, but I could sense the fragrance growing on me. I could learn to love this stuff, I decided. I just needed to take it one step at a time. Emerging from the shop, we found John and Quincy chatting with Merv. The truck had been loaded and covered with a tarp. We all piled in, Donia on Dory's lap in the middle of the bench seat, me on John's lap by the passenger door. Merv grinned broadly at us and waved as we drove away. He'd been friendly, but I couldn't help wondering what he was thinking. We were also greeted warmly at Squarey Brothers Hardware. Joe and Jane Squarey, if I never did see another brother, sold an unbelievable variety of items. The guys roamed happily around the large warehouse, making special note of tools, latches, metal and PVC pipe fittings, and spigots. Nails, screws, nuts, and bolts were in large bins with scales nearby. As they had for decades, customers weighed their purchases themselves and wrote the weights on the little paper bags. Dory carried on a running commentary as she led me around, pointing out objects we might need in the future. We'll want these gate hinges and latches for the new goat pen. That's the kind of wire fencing we'll use for the garden and the permanent animal pens. Stopping to pick up some metal objects, she added, you use these clips to fasten the wire to those metal poles over there. We saw chicken feeders and waterers, shovels and rakes and hoes, baffles and clevises again, and this time they were accompanied on the wall by shackles. We put one of those baffles inside our wood stove, Dory explained when I asked what they were used for. It keeps the top from getting too hot. But it doesn't have anything to do with clevises or shackles. Those are used to attach ropes or chains to something you want to tow. She continued the tour. When Dory noticed my eyes glazing over, she suggested I think of this place as a fabric store for a farm. That made me smile. I relaxed a bit and took notes in the little notebook I'd brought for that purpose. After leaving Squarey Brothers, Quincy drove us to the Standard gas station, which had a sewer dump station and an auto repair shop. Thinking about the hippies who'd been chased out of their encampment in the Santa Cruz Mountains the year before, we had decided not to build an outhouse. Instead, we would be bringing portable chemical toilets down here to empty. We watched an RV driver use the dump station. The process wasn't difficult. It just involved taking a long, flexible tube that the driver kept inside a hollow rear bumper and attaching it to a threaded hole on the concrete bib of the dump station. I noticed a plastic fitting on the end of the hose that had threads and screwed into the valve. The man opened a valve on his camper and the contents of his mobile septic tank flowed into the underground sewer. We walked over to the repair shop, Donia on Quincy's shoulders this time, and found a mechanic working under a car suspended on a lift. Seeing Quincy, he wiped his hands and came over to greet us. Let me know if you need help the first time you use the dump station, he said after Quincy introduced John and me. But most people using it know all the ins and outs of attaching the hoses and cleaning the station, so you probably won't need me. Just watch them and ask questions. He turned back to his work. I felt relieved knowing that at least these three business owners would accept us into their shops without issue. Obtain most of the supplies we would need in our own community. Done with our tour for the day, we took Jane Squarey's parting suggestion and headed for Al Staddy's Corner Drug, back toward Main Street. There we relaxed, and sitting at the counter on tall stools that probably dated back to the 50s, we treated ourselves to the first of many thick and delicious old-fashioned milkshakes, vanilla, strawberry, and chocolate, 50 cents each.
Well, I'm going to jump in. Hi, everybody. I'm Robin Shepard, and Marlene, thank you so much for inviting me to participate today and ask you some questions. As a fellow writer, you know, it's really good to be together and sharing your work. And we'll talk about how people who haven't gotten the book can get it at the end of the meeting. But there's a question we always have to ask a writer, and that is, what's the why? Why did you decide to write this book, Marlene?
Well, I really do think that it was partly my granddaughter, but it was really one of my daughters. I have a stepdaughter named Jamie who wasn't part of this adventure at all, and she'd heard bits and pieces of it as she was growing up. And when we went on family trips, she always called shotgun and sat next to me in the front and asked me questions about our trip. As she grew up, she actually attended a memoir workshop sometime during her college years. And she said to me, you got to do this. You've got to take a memoir workshop and you've got to write this stuff down. So she kept after me. And then the next thing that happened was Stella started after me. So I just decided to do it.
Great, thank you. And, you know, there's the traditional approach, you know, to a book, writing the outline, the chapters, chapter by chapter, getting your draft together. is that how you approached it? I mean, how long did it take you to kind of just cogitate on whether you were going to do it or not? And how long did it take you to actually write it from start to finish?
Well, it's good that you asked the question in two parts, because it took 20 years from the first time I thought about it till I actually began to write things down. And I began to write things down primarily in writing workshops. I would go away for a weekend to a writing workshop and we would do a prompt. You know, what was one of the strangest things that ever happened to you? And I would describe milking a goat or watching a goat have babies. And I would just write a little bit, you know, a paragraph or two, not a lot of detail, but I collected lots of these things in my journals over the years. And then one day, about 3 years ago, I decided it was time to go. And I use something called Scrivener. Some of you who write may be familiar with it. It's a really good piece of software that allows you to just throw your writing into it in all kinds of different ways. And then there's a corkboard feature, so you can take your little sections and rearrange them until you're happy with the way they are. So I used Scrivener for about a year to get the book in order. And then I printed it all out, sent it out for review. I have lots of friends who read it, lots of writers who read it and gave me feedback. That process took a year.
So let's talk about that. I mean, writing is such a solitary internal act. And so did you have any particular mentors that really helped you get going or helped you take a direction?
I did. While I was still living in Morgan Hill, in fact, fairly early on, and it's described in the book, I found out about Ellen Bass, who lives over here in Santa Cruz and was at that time, a fledgling poet, but very generous with her time and with her skills. And she offered writing workshops primarily for women, and she called them Writing About Our Lives. And so I would drive over the hill. I had some wonderful teenage girls. One of them's here with us today, who babysat for me up at the property and allowed me to get away to do that. And then when I moved over here to Santa Cruz, I met a friend of Ellen's, Laura Davis, who was leading writing workshops, also very much for women writing about their lives, although she didn't call them that. And I attended her workshops for about 5 years. So the latter 2 years or so of that, I was bringing my memoir in. And between those two mentors and the wonderful participants in the writing workshops, I got a lot of help.
Did you ever have a point in time in the early portion of this journey writing where you considered going with a novel instead of a memoir? And if so, how did you make the decision?
I didn't. I wanted to tell the story the way I remembered it. And one of the things that I came to understand, I spent a lot of time visiting my friends who had been on the land with me and talking to them about what I was going to write and how would they feel about it and so forth. But one of the things I came to realize is that everybody has their own perception of what happened. And I wanted to write my version. I wanted to just write my story. So all the way along, I was filtering out stories that I knew I wouldn't tell. There's all kinds of stories that I didn't tell because they weren't my story. They were Bob's story, or they were Quincy's story, or they were Dory's story. And although I may have alluded to them along the way, I just wanted to tell my story. And it's the fiction, if there's anything in it, is in the conversations that we had, which of course I couldn't possibly have remembered. But I got approval from the people who I lived with that I got the gist of it, even if the words were made up.
Right. I wanted to ask you, you know, stories are obviously more interesting when they're set in context so people can connect. So how did you go about researching events as the backdrop of your story?
Well, that was the fun part. I love research. I couldn't seem to get out of college. I just kept signing up for more every year, all the way through my life. And so I researched partly with my own background. I keep everything. And I have 2 file cabinets of correspondence and financial papers from the years when I was running the Morgan Hill Trading Post, and lots of newspaper articles during that period of time. And every column that I ever wrote for the San Jose Mercury, which I did for 10 years. And those contained little nuggets of things that were happening around me, and that was really helpful. I used the library in Morgan Hill to look at the old books that people were publishing back in those days. We had a couple of others. The Hills West of El Toro, I remember, was one of them. And I contacted the Morgan Hill Historical Society for help on a couple of specific things, like who was the guy who owned the Standard Station, and was it a Standard Station? You know, what kind, we don't have Standard Stations anymore. So I was trying to remember what it was actually called and which block it was on, which corner it was on. And people helped me with that stuff. They were wonderful.
That's great. Did you write the story really chronologically from beginning to end, or did you take a different approach?
No, I wrote it randomly, and that actually is not something I'd recommend. Because I spent most of the last year responding to people's comments that I don't know where we are in this story. Has John been born yet? You know, you have two goats in this story, and in the next one you don't have any goats yet. So I started attaching dates to specific events. I still have the butcher paper along my wall. You can't see it, but I'm staring at it. I took a piece of butcher paper and stretched it out across the wall, and I put every year from 1973 to 83 on there. And as I figured out what happened in each of those years, a lot of it was going through old photographs and trying to figure out how old my children were. Any of you with children will recognize that technique. And then I would write them on the timeline. And finally, I was able to take all the pieces and put them back where they belonged. It was like a giant jigsaw puzzle.
A lot can happen between inspiration and publication, right? And so how did you decide what to include and what to leave behind from your original writings?
Well, a number of great writers have said basically it takes a very long time to take everything out that you need to take out of a story to get down to the real nitty gritty. And that is true. It's a long process. Partly it had to do with me asking questions of my readers. Is this interesting? Is this story telling you something? Is there an arc? Every single chapter should have some kind of an arc of what's going on in there, some kind of lesson learned or something that didn't work that we figured out how to make work another time later. So yes, there was a lot of start and stop and a lot of throwing out. I have boxes of material that I didn't use.
What about people? I know, once you've written your story, it kind of takes on a life of its own. As you start to share it, were you surprised by any of the reactions of people who were in the story or your family?
My immediate family, my children, show very little interest in reading the book, to be quite truthful, except for Jamie, who read every single page of it in manuscript form and did a good job of editing. But my three other children, they were waiting for the hardcover, they weren't that excited about it. But the people who lived it with me were fascinated, and they asked to read drafts. One member of our group, Nina, who lives up in the mountains, she went on to have a career of teaching literature at four-year universities. So I was really blessed to have her on my side reading the book and giving me recommendations. And she told me a couple of stories that I hadn't remembered. She told me a story about Willie getting mangled by the other dogs, which you will come across late in the book. And I had completely forgotten that story. So that was kind of interesting. And I went out to the coast to visit a friend who I knew had been at the goat barbecue, and asked her some questions. And she told me some things I hadn't remembered also. So the memories of other people actually stimulated my own memory, and that was remarkable. Nobody said, don't print this. Nobody said, I don't want to be in it. Bob and Jan Fabini told me I was spelling their dog's name wrong, so they gave me the correct spelling of their dog's name. Things like that matter to people.
So did the act of writing out your story reveal anything to you about your inner self or your past that hadn't really surfaced for you before you wrote?
Oh, absolutely. It was a very therapeutic process. The ending of my, this is a little bit of a spoiler here, but the ending of my marriage to John Bumgarner had been cloaked in pain for so many years. I had never examined it. I'd never really tried to figure out what had happened. I was just so disappointed that it had happened. And I wasn't planning to include him in the book. It wasn't his story. It was my story, and he stole it from me. As I began writing, people started asking questions. Well, where's your husband during this time? What was he doing? How was he feeling? What was the effect of this on him? And I found that they were interested in knowing that. Now, I didn't, at the beginning of this book, I still had him with me, not with me, but he was still with us. And he and I started a Google Doc with just the bare facts of the timeline. And so he knew I was going to do this, but he had passed away by the time I actually got the book written. So I could never go back to him and say, did I do this right? I tried to be honest to his memory, and his sister has read the book and she believes that I was. But I've learned a lot about myself and about him just by writing it. I've forgiven him and I've forgiven myself for the things that we did and said during those difficult years.
Can you touch on one, if you had to pick one aspect of living on the land that was the most challenging for you, what would that be?
I think that was after the original people who were living with us had to leave. They were forced off the land. And I don't want to give the details because I want you to read the book, but the details are in there. But several people were forced off the land, and now I was up there mostly alone with my children and the animals. And that loneliness was hard for me. I had never really bought into the idea of being a hermit. I really liked the idea of community. And for the first 5 years that we were up there, we were a community and we worked together. And that part of it I just loved. I did stick it out another 4 years, but it was lonely.
When you look back on those years and then think about where we are today, just living here in this region, what do you think was something, that you learned during that time that you think is still very relevant today that readers might kind of, glean from reading your book?
I think it's important to stay close to the earth, and there's a variety of ways in which you can do that. In Santa Cruz, especially during the water crisis a few years ago, all the lawns were torn up and people put vegetable beds in their front yards. Probably not exactly home and garden style, but it was an interesting statement that they were making, which was, we need our food. We need good food, and this is one way to utilize this space and this time to do that. I think that for me, gardening, going to the farmer's market, working with other people who do the same, that became a real touchstone for me. And after I left the land, I took my garden with me wherever I lived. I lived in a condo for a few years. I had pots all over the place. I just wrote a blog for an online magazine for women over 50. It's actually women over 60. It's called 60 Plus, on how to do garden beds again, on how to do portable gardens, how to do them in pots if you're living in a small environment. Raising animals became very important to me, although the animals that we raised over the next several years were much more of the kind that you do in the city. We had gerbils and we had rabbits and we had geckos and little lizards and dogs and cats. But my kids have grown up now, and it's interesting to watch. My daughter lives just down the street from me. She raises chickens. My son has a huge organic garden. And even my daughter, who lives in Washington, D.C., has an herb garden in her kitchen. So I feel like I have passed that on a little bit to them.
Is there a character in your memoir that we will love to hate?
Oh, yes. The man who sold us the property and then spent the next 10 years trying to get us off of it.
Why is that?
Well, it was never clear to me why that was, but I suspect that he really just wanted to sell it because he needed money. but he liked going up there and letting his horses run loose, and he liked hunting on the land, and we kind of got in his way. So there was a lot of grief that came from that.
Wow. So this is kind of a broad sweeping question, but how will readers be likely to feel at the end of your book?
Well, I hope that at very least they'll be entertained. And I've had a number of people who've come to me after it and said, it really is like Little House on the Prairie. There's parts of it that just don't even seem real, that seem like you made a magic fairyland to live in. But then it comes down to earth, something dies or something doesn't work, something gets broken, you get stuck in the mud. But I think when they come to the very end of it, if they make it all the way through the afterword and the post-log, I think they'll find a completion and a satisfaction that it all came out okay.
Great. And I know I can see, just looking around, we have some people with interesting histories who also happen to be pretty good writers on this Zoom call. And so I'd like to ask you, because I'm thinking I'm not the only one with this question, how did you go about deciding how to publish the book? Agent, publishing house, self-publishing? It seems to be a big question these days.
It is. It's a very big question. And I certainly didn't expect to find a publisher for a memoir. I had, early on in the writing of this, I had one day, I don't know what it exactly made me think of it, but I thought about the editor of my very first book. I wrote my first book in 1975, and it was published by St. Martin's Press. I was very lucky. And, in those days, you could actually write a query letter to a publisher. And I did that. I wrote my query letter to St. Martin's Press, and Paul DeAngelis answered it. He was a young editor at that time who happened to like food. And I was proposing a book called The Book of Whole Grains. So he helped me through that book. And one day, as I was starting in on the actual construction of this manuscript, I thought, well, I wonder what Paul DeAngelis is doing these days. So I looked him up, and he's retired like me, and he's now doing book coaching like you, Robin. But I sent him a message, and I said, would you look at this manuscript and tell me, how do you think I should get it published? And he was wonderful. He was very kind. He did read it. And he said, well, I work with people that have top-notch publishers, and I don't know that I can guide you to one of those for this book, but here are 4 or 5 suggestions. And he gave me some really workable suggestions, and he recommended a book editor. And so I did purchase the services of a professional book editor at that point. He was one of the ones who said, make this logical, it's just too crazy. So when we got a little closer, I took all of the suggestions he had, and I did send it out to a half dozen agents or so, maybe a dozen. And then I sent it out to some small presses, not big presses, but small presses. And lo and behold, I got a yes. And that was a big surprise to me. So my book is published not by a vanity press, as we used to call them, and not even as a, what's it called, Robin, when you've got a hybrid. It's not even really a hybrid. It's actually a small press. I didn't pay a penny. He did all the work, and he's doing most of the marketing. Although my good friend Nancy, who's set this up, is doing all the rest. But that was really a very, very lucky. I was prepared to self-publish it if I needed to. And that was sort of several tiers down the way. If it had taken me another year to get nowhere, I would have published it myself.
Okay, well, that's really great. It's good to hear. Very encouraging. I want to ask you, Marlene, because this isn't your first book, but it's quite a book, and it's a departure from what you've written before. What's next?
I have 3 books lined up. About 4 years ago, I came up with the idea. I was a brand new grandmother, so suddenly I knew everything there was to know about being a grandmother. I decided to write a book that was about what is the role of grandparents in our society, kind of a sociology book, but one that would be readable to anyone. And I laid that out. I outlined it. I wrote a book proposal. I wrote 2 sample chapters, and I sent it out to 100. I sent out queries to 100 agents, and I got 10 positive responses, which is remarkable. That's a very high number. And 2 of the people specifically gave me directions about broadening out what was in the chapters and sending it back to them again. And right about that time, rather a bit of a surprise, my son got married and had a baby and asked me to come and be its nanny, her nanny. So I put the book aside and I went and spent 6 months being a nanny. And by the time I came home, my 2 other children had had children. So now I had 4 grandchildren, and I wasn't interested in writing that book anymore. So I put it aside. So that's the next project. I'm going to go back to that book. I also had an offer from this publisher that I'm using now to revise and republish Organic Cooking for Not So Organic Mothers, which I self-published in 1982. And you'll get to see the gory details of the publication of that book in my story, how that came to be. And so I'm also going to be I'm working on that now, actually. I've just been through the whole book and updated the recipes so they don't say things like I lit the stove, or if you want some nitrate-free hot dogs, you're going to have to find them at a natural food store. Obviously, things have changed since I wrote that book, so I've tried to update it and update all the recipes. And that book is almost ready to go to the publisher.
Now,
finally,
I think there was a question about your entrepreneurial venture, the Morgan Hill Trading Post, for people who've lived here long enough. Tell us what that was all about. What made you decide to do it, and what was it?
Well, while I was writing the Book of Whole Grains, I was living in Morgan Hill on our piece of property, and we didn't have a natural food store in Morgan Hill. There wasn't one in Gilroy. There was one of those white coat stores where they sold pills. I can't remember what they called those, but it was a chain of those, but it didn't have natural foods. So I was driving all the way over to Santa Cruz and up to San Francisco and Berkeley to buy things like herbs for my store and whole wheat flour for my store and grains and so forth. And I realized as I was doing that this was a natural market. Morgan Hill was prime for a natural food store. And so when the book was over, there's this interesting thing that happens for any of you who've written a book. When you finish, I learned to grind my own peanut butter. Yes, we did grind peanut butter in my health food store. I felt really isolated, lonely, and with nothing to do when I finished the book. It's kind of an interesting thing that happens after you finish a book. And so that was the natural thing to move to. I thought, well, okay, I'll open a store. I didn't know how to write a book, and I'd written a book. So I figured, I didn't know how to run a store, I'd figure it out. I went to a natural food store up in Menlo Park next to the Whole Earth Truck Store, and I volunteered my services, and she took me in as a volunteer, and I worked for her for several months learning how to work in a store, and she helped me figure out how to order, how to price, and what proportion of things I needed, and off I went.
That's great. I have a few more questions, but just in case anyone has to sign off, I don't want to forget to say we want to thank Booksmart and the Morgan Hill Historical Society and AAUW Morgan Hill for co-sponsoring this wonderful authors event, and to remind people that the book is available online and also via Booksmart, our local bookstore. And I wanted to make sure I said that before anyone hops off. And Nancy has posted the link, the Booksmart link there on the screen. I hope everyone can see that. It was also, I think, included in the email invitation. So Marlene, what about marketing your book? How's that going to go forward from here?
Well, I was encouraged to hire a book assistant or a writer's assistant. And that's what Nancy is doing for me. Nancy is helping me find the right places to go to set up things like this Zoom meeting. This is our third one. She's done a really wonderful job of setting up the graphics that you've been seeing on Instagram and Facebook, and that splash page she set up for today. She's just an absolutely amazing person, and she's got, and we have Alexa is I'm not sure quite how to describe what she does, but I think Alexa's on this call also. Hey, Alexa. She has set up a several page marketing plan for me. And Nancy's going to help me go through that marketing plan piece by piece. It looks like we've got a year's worth of work ahead of us. So my original plan before COVID-19 was to travel around the country again like I did in 1982. In 1982, when I wrote my second book, I hopped into a little motorhome and drove 7,500 miles, 10,500 miles around the country selling the book out of the back of my truck.
Wow.
This time I bought a 2020 Mercedes-Benz model motorhome. And I have it now. I bought it. I was going to go around in it this year, but I'm going to go around in it next year when this is all over. And
now, do you have a like a traditional writing habit that you follow? Some writers get up at 3 a.m. every day. What's your style?
Well, that's an interesting story. When I was raising the goats and running my store, I discovered that oh, there's Alexa. Hi, Marlene. Hi, Alexa. Sorry that I babbled over what you're good at, but she's really good. So if you contact me personally, I can put you in touch with her if you're interested. When I tried to get up at 6 in the morning to write, or to count my change for the store, or to milk a goat, my son would be awake. He was a real early morning guy. So then I tried getting up at 5:30 and he would be awake. And then I tried getting up at 4 and that seemed to not trigger him. So I did get in the habit of getting up at 4 in the morning, and I continue to do that. And I get up at 4 and I journal for at least an hour. And then because I have arthritis, I do a little stretching and a little yoga, sit in my hot tub, make my coffee. I'm probably not really good for the day till 7 o'clock, but I do write every day, and that really does make a difference.
Yeah, you know, you're closest to your subconscious when you first wake up during those wee hours, and so good for you. It's not easy to do sometimes. I also wanted to mention, I feel like I'm going to commercial or something. I wanted to mention that when people get Marlene's book, they can actually get a book plate from Marlene, since we can't be with her today for her to sign the books, which we all love to get our books signed by the authors. So Nancy, I don't know if you can post something about getting the book plates, but I think that's a great idea, great marketing.
They're on order. They'll be here in a couple of weeks, and I will send them out to anybody who requests them.
Great.
I think that Nancy put a link on the original registration link.
Have you gone back to the property that you lived on up above Chesbrough since you left?
I did. There were 2 teenage boys who used to spend almost every weekend with us. And one of them ended up getting married and moving to Morgan Hill. And without even realizing how close he was to the property, he bought a house on Oak Glen. So when I found that out, I asked him if he'd drive me up there. And that he was delighted to do that. We did discover when we got up there, the property now is owned by the time we went up there, my ex-husband had passed away. So the property is owned by his widow, and she rents it out. And so we were kind of stepping on toes by driving up there, but I took a lot of pictures. And then we saw this sign on a tree that said, due to the cost of ammunition, no warning shot will be, there will be no warning shot. So when we saw that, we sort of got back in our car and drove back off the property.
Things change, eh?
Yeah, I don't think that they were considering that guests were welcome at that point.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like that. You can't really go home again, right?
No, you can't. You can't.
Uh, um, so I bought my book from Booksmart just a week ago, I think. And I believe they have copies in the store right now. If you're downtown, you can get them right now at Booksmart. We love Booksmart. It's a nice paperback with a beautiful cover. And Marlene, your book is delightful to read.
Thank
Read-
you.
Yes.
I just want to mention, Nancy, that Brad just mentioned that he does have plenty of copies right now. Of course, he knows how to order more, and he has hardcovers, which is a coup. I sent hardcovers directly to him because right now Amazon isn't carrying them. Only Barnes and Noble has the hardcovers.
Okay. And is there anything, can I clarify again? Because I know quite a few people may be interested in reaching out to Nancy or Alexa. That was I think the contact information was mentioned in the chat. We might mention it again, but thank you for that. Thank you for everything, Marlene. And we will be looking forward to your next book.
Thank you. I do have a webpage. It's marlenebumgarner.com. And certainly if you want to get information about Alexa or Nancy or anything else, if you just want to chat, please feel free to drop in there and send me a message.
Yes, and I love your blog. People can follow your blog. And Marlene, we are looking forward on behalf of the Morgan Hill Historical Society. I would say we are looking forward to interviewing you on camera to find out more, because you do have a lot of history with the good people of Morgan Hill.
Thank you.
Yeah, and good luck with everything. Yeah.
Well, this has been fun, and it's been great to see all these notes as people have been chatting. A lot of friends here today, and I really appreciate you coming.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone.